No,
And so
mute
today
me.
we're going to talk about soil and aspects of soil. So definitely feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you need to. All right, so now it's not going. There we go. All right, so soil, it's important because it anchors roots, of course, supplies water to the plants, provides air for plant roots, which is really important because our plants photosynthesize and create their own energy in sunlight, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all plant parts, including roots, break down that energy and take in oxygen to break it down, to put that energy into growing. So if we can't get oxygen to the roots, then our root system will not grow. And so it's definitely important that we have a good balance in our soil. And then it also is where minerals are available for plant nutrition. So when we think about soil, we think about this kind of ideal situation. Now, none of us have this, but this is what we're trying to approach. This is what we're working for. That soil is about 45% minerals. That's going to be, basically the broken down rock that become from our parent material. 5% organic matter. That's going to be the leaves that are breaking down, the mulch that's breaking down. And then about half of it is air and half of it is water. We're not really going to get this true balance. Usually only people who have loamy soil get this. If you have clay, you're going to have a lot more water being held in your soil. If you have sandy soil like I do, I'm going to have a lot more air. But this is what we're trying to achieve. This is this ideal kind of ratio that, every gardener wants. And basically, between those pieces of organic matter and minerals are these pore spaces. The macropores are the large pores. They're the spaces that are in between that are filled with air. And the micropores are smaller spaces that hold water. As these soil particles compress, they'll hold water more. As they're looser, they hold more air. So this is something that's in flux. You may have heard of having compacted soil. So when your soil gets compacted, it holds more of these water pores more tightly. So this is something that changes, and this is something we can have an effect on. Again, we're trying to approach an even amount of micropores and macropores, or air spaces and water spaces is ideal. And each soil varies so greatly. I mean, soil is a component of the parent material. So where my parent material down here in Richland is mostly quartz, and I have very, very sandy soil. Probably your parent material is mostly granite, and you have mostly heavy clay, the red clay up there where y'all are located. So the parent material has a huge impact. Relief, which is, the topography. I have fairly flat topography, so I don't have a lot of erosion moving off hill. If you do have very sloped soil or slope for topography, you'll have more organic matter down at the base of the slope. And at the top of the slope, the soil will be more eroded. There'll be less nutrient capacity there. Climate has a huge impact. We have a very hot, humid climate. Organic matter is constantly breaking down. We constantly need to replenish it. And so our soils reflect that, as opposed to if you were to go see and look at a soil that was in the Midwest. Those soils hold on to a lot more organic matter. They hold on to it longer than ours do. And they're quite different from our soils. The organisms that are in the soil, the microorganisms, the larger organisms like earthworms, all have an impact. Earthworms will help to aerate the soil and create more of those macropores, those air spaces. Other organisms in the soil can help. Even fire ants can have a benefit of increasing air capacity and macropores in the soil. And then even time, most of the time our soils are old and weathered. They've been exposed, they've been farmed for hundreds of years. The only place in the earth where new soil is being created is where volcanoes are active. So Hawaii's adding new soil, but they're so different. And so, wherever you look, soils are going to be very different because of these different features. Now, they all have very similar, there's a similar set of properties. All soils have these horizons. They vary based on that topography, parent material, whatever organisms are present, but they're based in these layers. Now, the first layer, the top layer, is the O. That's where your organic matter is usually located. If you're lucky, it might be 2 inches thick. For me, I think it's like 1/8 of an inch thick because I have very sandy soil and everything just leaches through. So if you were to go out west where there wasn't as much rain, there was a higher amount of, in the plains, you would have a deeper organic level. You would have an O layer that could be 2 inches thick. You may find in parts of your landscape in your garden that you kind of approach around 1 inch, but you're going to be hard pressed to find a 2-inch O layer in South Carolina simply because of our weather. The A layer is where you have a lot of nutrients. And then the B layer is where stuff tends to move down through. This is where your nutrients move beyond the reach of most plant roots. Things like phosphorus, iron. As you water, as we get rainfall, as you irrigate, you're moving nutrients down from the O layer through the A down into the B layer. And this varies. Those layers can be, that A layer can be 10 inches thick, or it can be 20 inches thick. If I were to go out in my yard where I haven't done any amending and I dig a hole, I can dig a hole 4 foot, 5 foot, 6 foot deep, and it's nothing but sand. And so that has a huge impact on how plants grow in my soil. Some plants are going to do very well. Some plants are not going to do well at all, and I'll have to amend. But knowing what those characteristics are of my soil helps me approach amending and helps me select plants. Because when it comes to horticulture, we have 2 choices. We can pick plants that are going to do very well in our native soil that we're not going to have to do a lot of amending for. Those are typically our native plants. They're used to those conditions. They've become accustomed to those conditions over hundreds and hundreds of years. Or we're going to have to amend our soil and manipulate our soil to grow certain things that we want to. For example, if you want to grow vegetables, you're going to have to come in and really amend your soil, especially for me because I have such sandy soil. But these layers exist. They're in all different amounts. And it's really interesting next time you go out and dig a hole in your landscape, kind of look to see where those layers are. Sometimes, especially in clay soils, they're really distinct lines that you will see as you dig that hole. All right, so soil has physical, chemical, and biological properties, and they interact with each other and on each other to give the soil different characteristics. So soil texture is a physical property. It is a breakdown of the size of the soil particles. And we have 3 different types. They're classified as sand, silt, or clay. And they're classified as sand, silt, or clay particles based purely on their size. So if you were to look at a piece of coarse sand, like I have in my garden, it would be like the size of a huge beach ball. But a particle of clay, which might be like you have in your garden, would be like the pin, the head of a pin. So very, very tiny. They're just broken down by size. And this size has an impact on how soil particles hold water, hold nutrients, create air spaces. And you can see that clay is really, really tiny compared to the size of coarse sand, which is kind of what I have. So when we think about these particles, think about sand as kind of like rounded, almost like rough beach ball sizes. I like to picture it as like a container of ping pong balls. You've got all that airspace around it. Whereas clay are kind of like poker chips. They get stacked on each other. And so there's very little space in between, but they're kind of flattened on each other. They have lots and lots of surface area though, because even though the sand particles are bigger, they have less surface area. Whereas the clay, even though it's smaller, it has lots of ridges and bumps and kind of stacked on each other. Surface area is where the ability to hold on to things comes into play. So this is a classic soil science thing that we refer to, the soil textural triangle. And I'm right down here at the very bottom of the left corner. I have 90% sand with 10% clay. Our soils lab at Clemson does not break down your soil texture for you, but there are other land grant universities that will. Penn State does. And I sent my soil off to Penn State and they run it through different size sieves and basically based on those particle sizes tell you what your percentage is. So mine is 90% sand, 10% clay. It's like walking at the beach. But loam is like that ideal soil. And you can see very few of us would fall into loam with about 40 to 50% sand, about 30 to 50% silt, and coming in from the left side, looking at 50 to maybe 70% clay. But clay dominates this triangle. A lot of us have clay soil, and clay, a little bit even, as much as 30, 40% clay will provide most of those characteristics. So even if your soil is only 40% clay, but you have more loam, you're going to have a lot of those characteristics that clay soils have. So knowing your texture is important. It will help you know how your soil is going to hold on to water and how it's going to hold on to nutrients. You can tell, you don't have to send your soil off. You can do this field test. Basically, you get yourself about a couple of inches, about a handful of soil. You want it to be moist, like a well-wrung sponge, and squeeze it. If it does not hold its shape, it's mostly sand. If you squeeze it and it holds its shape, it's fairly loamy. And then once you drop it, it breaks apart. It's fairly loamy. If you squeeze it, it holds its shape and it continues to hold its shape, then you can kind of run your finger on it and try to create a ribbon. And depending on how long you can get that ribbon, you can kind of see how much clay dominates your soil. But for most of us, you either have sand or you have clay. There's a few places in the state of South Carolina where it's loamy, but the majority of us either have sand or clay. So another important aspect of physical properties of soil is this idea of structure. It is how these different particles arrange themselves. And it's how they stick together with the spaces in between. Good structure has a decent amount of air spaces and water spaces, macropores and micropores. and tries to get close to that balance. Good structure allows plants to break down their energy and grow fairly well. And when we have good structure in our soil, our plants grow much better. So we have healthy trees, healthy shrubs, healthy lawns. And so mostly what we're looking for, is this kind of granular, this kind of like cake batter look. And if you look at it, you can kind of see that it's what we're thinking of when we think of really good soil, because it's crumbly, it's light, it's friable, it's arable, it's, it just looks like it's healthy. It looks like what plants want to grow in. Unfortunately, that's not always what we have when we go dig a hole in our backyard. I have no structure. If I dig a hole, I've just got loose sand and it just moves all over. It's like walking on a dune at the beach. You may dig a hole and see that it's very compressed and tight and very hard to dig a hole in. And so your problem with clay soils is that you don't get enough air in your soil, it's not friable enough. So this is what we're looking for. This is what we're trying to get. We want good structure. And the good news is we can improve our soil structure. This is something we can work on. We can't change the texture, but we can change the structure, and we can work towards keeping good structure. And a well-structured soil allows for those roots to go deep. You have, response and your plant growth is very good, as opposed to a compacted soil. Those roots get stunted. They can't break down their energy as well. They don't get as much oxygen, so they don't grow as well. And this will impact your vegetables. This will impact your roses. This will impact your turf grass. Whatever you're trying to grow, it will be shortened and limited in a compacted soil. And these are just some influences that texture has on soil properties. So I have sand, so I have excellent aeration. My plants have no problem getting air, but water just pours through my soil. It's very hard for me to hold on to moisture in my soil. My plants will very quickly show the signs of drought. I have very poor nutrient holding capacity. There's a joke about my sandy soils in the Midlands. It's not as bad as it looks, it's worse. But clay soils are good because they actually can help they have a fair amount of moisture retention. They have pretty decent nutrient holding capacity, but the problem is water doesn't infiltrate. So with your heavy clay soils, you can have water sit around those roots and not move away. So we'll see more root rots develop in heavier clay soils. They're also harder to dig in sometimes. Loam, which is what everybody wants, you see it's kind of fair across the board. Again, that's that ideal kind of, 50% air space, 50% water space, and 5% organic matter and 45% of those minerals that make up their soil. Very few of us have it. So soil texture affects the soil's ability to hold on to water. And water particles, and especially clay, because clay, it has a lot of surface area. It has an ability to really hold on strongly to water. You have to apply more water to a clay soil before plants can take water out of the soil. So for me, with my sandy soil, I know if I apply 1/3 of an inch of water, my plants can take up that water. They're going to take it up, and what they don't is just going to move down through and be lost. It's going to move down through the soil column beyond where the roots can take it up. Whereas if you have a clay soil up there in the upstate and you apply 1/3 of an inch of water, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to do anything for your plants, because you have to have a certain amount of water in your soil before the roots can actually take the water out of the soil. If there is less than 2 or 3 inches of water in a clay soil, then a plant actually has to exert energy to pull that water away from the soil. So the biggest impact this has is that when you go to water your soil, you'll actually apply an inch at a time, one day. This will ensure that your soil has plenty of water to where it's available so that plants can actually take it out of the soil without exerting energy to kind of break those bonds between the clay soil and the water. So this is another representation of that same idea. You just have water that, because soil particles, because they can hold on to the water, especially clay, it just gets tied up. And so typically 1 inch once a week is sufficient for irrigation for these heavy clay soils. Whereas in a sandy soil, I'm usually 1/3 to 1/2 inch twice a week. Because I can't, if I put out more than 1/2 inch, my sandy soil, it's just running through it and it's being wasted. There's no point to irrigate more than 1/2 inch at a time because it's just wasted. All right, so soils also have chemical properties. So we talked about the physical, now we're going to talk about the chemical. And chemical properties start with this idea of cation exchange capacity. So the particle of clay on the left-hand side, I want you to kind of imagine that a particle of soil is like a table with chairs around it. And for me, my sandy soil is like your kitchen table. My sandy soil has about 4 to 6 chairs that can fit around it. And these are exchange sites. This is where nutrients are attracted to the soil particle and it can hold on to it. So my sandy soil is like a kitchen table with 4 to 6 seats around it. Your clay is like your dining room table, where like it can hold anywhere from 12 to 16 seats. And each of those seats are an exchange site where nutrients are attracted to the particle. So things like potassium or calcium or magnesium, these ions are attracted to the particles of clay. The cation exchange capacity is a measure of how many of these exchange sites are on each particle of soil. And if you get a soil sample done through Clemson, it will tell you the CEC, or the cation exchange capacity of the soil. Basically, what it boils down to is how fertile is your soil. Your fertility is your soil's ability to hold on to these nutrients. Clay is more fertile than sand. So this is an ability of a soil to hold on to nutrients. Another aspect of soil is pH. pH is a scale, logarithmic scale, and on one end, on the low end, is acidic soil, and on the upper end is alkaline soil. And so you've got this range of acidity or sour soil, and alkaline, or what's called sweet soil. Most of our plants want to be between 5.5 to 6.5. Not quite neutral, a little bit slightly acidic. And the reason most of our plants like to sit at this is because where nutrients are available. Now, you can change the pH of your soil. So when you get a soil sample done, it will come back and it will tell you the pH. Most of the time, we tend to have acidic soils. Our soils are acidic because we get a lot of rainfall. We're a hot, humid climate. We have very weathered and exposed soils. They've been farmed for years, multiple years. We've lost a lot of our rich topsoil. New neighborhoods come in, they take a lot of that topsoil off. So most of our soils tend to be acidic. If somebody has an alkaline soil where the soil pH is above a 7, close to an 8, they've been doing something. I know they've been doing something They've probably been going out there and spreading wood ashes everywhere to get that pH up that high, because we typically just don't see that naturally in South Carolina. So when you have your soil sample and it tells you your pH, a lot of times you get a recommendation to add lime. Now that raises the pH, but it's not overnight. It goes through that process where the hydrogen ions that are sitting on the soil particles. So you have little hydrogen ions sitting around the kitchen table, and then you have the lime, and the lime breaks off into calcium ions and carbon and oxygen ions. So the calcium ions are what we want. That's what helps to kick off those hydrogen ions. And basically it comes down to size. Hydrogen ions are small. I always picture it like my younger son. My younger son is like the hydrogen ion sitting in the chair at the kitchen table. And my older son is like the calcium. It's a bigger ion. And it comes and it knocks them out and goes, hey, I want to sit here. And it just kicks it off the exchange site and bonds where that hydrogen was. So then the hydrogen is now free, floating in the soil, and it bonds with oxygen to make water. It's a process. So when you add lime, it takes a while for this thing to occur. In sandy soils, it can take up to 4 months. But in heavier clay soils, adding lime and seeing the result of that pH increase can take time, as much as 9 to 10 months, because of that process. The lime has to break apart, and those calcium ions have to replace all the little hydrogen ions on each particle of soil. So when you take your soil sample in the fall and it tells you your pH is low, it is good to take it in the fall so you have plenty of time to apply that lime and let that pH change occur before growth starts in the spring. Because if we're talking about 9 months, 8 months, 9 months, putting out lime in October, in November is ideal to have conditions right for plant growth in May, which is, typically when we want to start late April, May with our garden, and a lot of plant growth resumes. So it is a process. It is something that takes time. Soil pH has another impact on nutrient availability for our plants. So you can see if we have a low pH, so if our soil pH is sitting at 5.5, then nitrogen, which is one of the most needed nutrients for plants, they have the highest requirement for nitrogen, and nitrogen is responsible for leafy green growth. It's important in a lot of photosynthetic steps. So it's vastly important to plant growth. But if our pH is sitting at 5.5, then nitrogen is limited in its availability. So even if we put out fertilizer, the plants can't take it up. It's just kind of wasted. So it's really important that we get our pH right. And mostly we want it between 6 and 6.5, because that's when the 17 nutrients that are needed for good plant growth are most available. You can see if we dip down, to the 5, some nutrients are limited, or if we go up to even an 8, our micronutrients get limited. So we might have something like an iron deficiency or a manganese deficiency. So for most plants, ideally around a 6 to a 6.5 is the pH we're looking for. So on top of those chemical properties, soil has biological properties. Soil is alive and it is filled with all these microorganisms. 1 gram of soil can hold anywhere from 10 to 5,000 nematodes. Nematodes are microscopic worms. They're more numerous in sandy soil, but they do show up in clay soils. Nematodes can be beneficial. They can feed on other insects in the soil, or they can be harmful. They can be plant parasitic nematodes. For any of you who grow vegetable gardens, if you've ever seen root knot nematodes, they've got these swollen nodules on the roots of your plants. They can really limit the uptake of water and nutrients for a plant. Algae can be in the soil. anywhere from 1,000 to 500,000 protozoas that feed on algae and nematodes, and then even fungi and bacteria can be quite numerous. And we actually need these in our soil because these fungi and bacteria and protozoa, they break down organic matter. They help with the decay process. So right now our trees are losing all their leaves. And these leaves, as they break down, are being broken down by bacteria and fungi in the soil. So they take that organic matter and break it down to where these nutrients can be taken up by plants. They make them in plant available forms. So they're really, really important, especially if we're going to use organic fertilizers, because they take and break down organic fertilizers that are not in plant available form and put them into plant available form. They break down organic matter, so they're very important for the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, especially nitrogen. Nitrogen is constantly in flux in your soil. If you ever get a soil sample done, it doesn't tell you the amount of nitrogen because it changes from week to week, day to day. Nitrogen is added to the soil by decaying leaves, worms moving through the soil, feeding and doing what they do. Fertilizer. Nitrogen is taken in by some plants from the atmosphere. So they can, a lot of the legumes can fixate nitrogen out of the atmosphere and just take it out and put it straight into growth. Most plants can't do that. And so there's a lot of moving parts in the nitrogen cycle, but just know that it's in constant flux. And since nitrogen is the nutrient that's needed most by plants, that usually limits plant growth. Plants still need oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon, but that's delivered through the soil and through the atmosphere. Nitrogen is the one that we think of when, it's that first number in our fertilizer bag. It is hugely important to plant growth. Microorganisms can also tie up nutrients. We can have a problem where we have too much organic matter and they can tie up the nutrients. When you choose organic fertilizers, you want to check how long it takes for them to be converted. Something like fish emulsion, has a short time period from when you put it out to when the nutrients are available for plants to be taken up. It can be anywhere from, a couple of days to 2 weeks. A lot of it depends on temperature. When it's colder and dry, your microorganisms aren't as active, so they aren't doing all that conversion for you. As opposed to in the heat of July and you've been watering your garden, it will go a lot quicker because those microorganisms are using that nitrogen source for food. They break it down, they put it into their life force, their energy, and it becomes released in a plant available form. So something like blood meal being used in late April may take 6 weeks before you see the response in your plants. Whereas if you were to use blood meal in July or June, a lot warmer, a lot more moisture present, you'll see the response in your plants after about 3 weeks after application. So that is important to be aware of that if you're going to use organic fertilizers. There's a soil fungi called mycorrhizae, and they're actually extremely beneficial. They mostly form relationships with our woody plants. So our shrubs and our trees, not so much with our vegetables. Our vegetables, they're annuals, they tend to have more relationships with the bacteria in the soil than they do the fungi. But the soil fungi, the mycorrhizae, they live inside and outside the plant roots. And these fungi actually send out their hyphae, these long, thin strands, and it goes in search of water and nutrients. So it actively quadruples the root size of the plant, because it's bringing back nutrients and water well beyond the reaches of the plant's roots. And in exchange for this, the plant gives off sugars, because the fungi can't photosynthesize for itself. It can't make its own food. It can't make its own sugars. So the plants produce sugar, give a little extra to the mycorrhizae, and the mycorrhizae in exchange bring water and nutrients. So it's really cool relationship that they have with each other. And this is what the hyphae look like. They're these little white thin strands, and you can actually see them with the human eye. If you were to look at a plant and pull up the roots, sometimes you'll see it in your mulch, little fine white threads around your plants. Very beneficial, very important. And actually, they have found that the fungi, the mycorrhizae, will actually protect the plants. So this is a nematode, microscopic worm, coming in to attack the plant roots. And you can see the mycorrhizae, the fungi, that has effectively choked off that nematode and is stopping it from attacking the plant. So these microorganisms in the soil are really a huge aspect of healthy plant growth. And the nice thing is it's easy to build this relationship. We can have this actively in our soil, and it's very easy to do. This picture, I just want you to see on the left, that's a pine tree sapling, just a seedling starting. On the right is its root system with mycorrhizae. So you can see if that little pine tree was just the root system alone dependent for getting water and nutrients, very limited. But when you add mycorrhizae into the system, that's the fungal hyphae, all those white strands just going out and actively mining for nutrients and water for the plant. And you can see how the plant would benefit from this. It just will grow faster and has more access to nutrients. It can outcompete anything else that may be in that area. So the best way to promote these microorganisms is to incorporate organic matter. That organic matter can be your homemade compost. It can be bringing in leaf litter. It can be using an organic mulch that breaks down. You can get, bagged mushroom compost, bagged black cow, bagged stout ollie. Any of those things are fine. We're looking for is organic matter. We want to till as little as possible. So you don't want to come in and actively till. There are things that you can do in your vegetable garden to limit tilling, but especially in your landscape, and you just want to come in, you want to plant your plants, you want to top with organic matter. We want to minimize soil compaction. Remember, soil compaction compresses down those soil particles, and it makes a lot more water spaces, micropores, and it limits the macropores, the oxygen. And those microorganisms need oxygen. They breathe in the oxygen, they use it to break down those nutrients, and they make them available for plants to take up. So we want to minimize walking across the landscape. Or if we're in our landscape beds, we want to make sure that we have a good 2 to 3 inches of mulch to help reduce compaction. In your lawn, you will want to actually look at having the lawn core aerated on a regular basis to help minimize compaction, help promote those microorganisms. It's really important that we maintain a favorable soil pH. We tend to have acidic soils. Our rainfall tends to push us towards acidity. So getting your soil pH checked every once in a while can help make sure that those microorganisms are present. They don't like acidic conditions, so they typically like to be around where the soil pH is, about a 6 to 6.5. So all these things that we can do to help promote microorganisms in our soil, keep them healthy, and then we'll in turn keep our plants healthy. So organic matter, not only is it important for the biological properties of our soil, but it also helps with the physical. For every 1% of organic matter content, our soil can hold more plant available water. Now, I just showed you that slide way back that said, oh, you needed to have, several inches of water before in a heavy clay soil before your plants could even use it. Well, this expands that plant available water. It makes it easier when you have organic matter in your clay soil. It makes it easier for your plants to take that water out and use it. So not only does it increases that plant available water, so you don't even have to water as much if you have a heavy clay soil, if you incorporate organic matter. You can test for organic matter. It's good to do every 2 to 3 years. It can be added on to a soil sample through Clemson. I think it's like $5 now. And it'll tell you the percentage of your soil that is organic matter. We have hot, humid climate. Our organic matter is constantly breaking down. It is something that we always want to think about adding. With my sandy soil in my garden, I pull back the mulch and I'll top dress different gardens, usually in the spring. It's a good job to start doing in late January, early February, as we start to get some warm weather, but not too hot. So in my personal garden, I have 2 acres and it's all in the backyard, and I have different areas. I have a rose garden where I don't even know how many rose bushes are in there, but I've got a mix of tea roses and grandifloras and floribundas, and just some different shrub roses. And to keep those roses happy and healthy, I pull back the mulch and I top dress with compost. No more than, half an inch. I'm just bringing it in and top it. And that is enough to really change that soil profile. My roses are so much healthier. And that soil, to look at, is so rich and dark, and that classic example of what you think of when you think of a healthy soil, versus outside my rose garden where I just have a path of centipede. It's like beach sand. So ideally 2.5% is really, really good for our hot, humid Southeast. Don't be disappointed. I know a farmer here in Richland County who cover crops, and he's typically around 2 to 2.5 with adding all this organic matter. So even if you can approach 1.5 to 2, you're actually getting a lot of benefit from that organic matter. You want to incorporate it in the form of dry, well-aged compost when you're adding to a new landscape bed. It's 135 cubic yards per acre to get a 1-inch thick layer, which is basically 3 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, or 9 1 cubic foot bags per 100 square feet. So if you're going to be putting in a new landscape bed, that you're planning on adding this fall or this early spring, go ahead and add that organic matter. And it can be mushroom compost, it can be your own compost, it can be, bulk compost. I would get it tested, do a soil sample, just to see, because bulk compost, it changes a lot. There's no regulation. And I have seen where some places have had compost that it's got a pH of 8, and sometimes stuff that's been brought in has a low pH. So, you do want to test it once just to see, or ask the place if they have the bulk amendments, if they get it tested, if they have an idea of what their compost is, what the pH is, what the nutrient value is. The bag stuff is usually pretty good at being, around a pH of 6.5 to 7, fairly good nutrients. It's fairly consistent. You can actually also test your own compost if you make your own compost in your yard, to just see what the pH is and the nutrient value. But stout ollie, mushroom compost, black cow, any of that stuff would be fine to use. And it brings all those benefits of increasing and promoting good soil structure, promoting soil microorganism health, promoting holding on to and increasing water availability for plants. So huge benefit from adding organic matter. And I can't stress that enough. Every plant, every situation always is improved by adding organic matter. A heavy clay soil and you add organic matter, drainage increases. You see less root rot diseases. In my sandy soil where I feel like I have to water constantly and I have poor nutrient holding capacity, it's improved by adding organic matter. I don't have to water as much and I can support the growth of heavy feeding plants like roses. So every soil condition can be improved by adding organic matter. The only thing where I wouldn't is if you were doing succulents, just because you need that drainage. So I wouldn't add as much, but definitely still they would benefit from a little organic matter, just not as much. And your vegetable garden is one of your hardest working gardens. Definitely want to keep consistently adding organic matter in that space. This is from a garden, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is from a garden in Colombia. The soil samples were taken 5 feet from each other. The one on top is in the vegetable garden where it was amended, added with compost. And the other sample on the bottom is outside the vegetable garden where nothing was amended, where it was just left. And you can see that difference in color, but you can see the difference in structure. You can see how the plant roots are kind of moving all through the top soil sample, but it's kind of chunky and broken up into layers. And you can see almost like cake layers in that bottom sample. Really limited plant growth, really limited coloration. So 10 feet apart, just the regular addition of organic matter. And this was, the garden was started and amended for 3 seasons. So this is in 3 years of adding organic matter, the improvement. And it's not something that goes away. Organic matter does break down and it delivers about 25% of its nutritional availability to plants in the first year. And then it'll deliver 25% more in the second year. And then it gets to the point where it's not giving any more nutrients, but, and this is called at the stage it's finally broken down, it's humus. It's not going to break down any further. So it's not giving up nutrients at that point, but it's still improving structure. It's still improving water holding capacity. It's still, because it has so much surface area, improving nutrient holding capacity. And so even though we're not getting nutrients directly from it, it still is improving. So it breaks down, but there is some left every year on a residual. So it's not something where you have to bring in an acre or several cubic yards every year to have this type of benefit. It does keep adding on to itself, but you still want to do it every year. All right. Excuse me. A soil sample can be done, and it can tell you a lot of this stuff, especially the chemical parts. It will tell you the pH and the nutrient value and give you recommendations for fertilizer and lime, specifically for your soil. Best practice is to have a soil sample done every year, especially in your vegetable garden, in your lawn, and in your general landscape where you have trees and shrubs. I would do it every 2 to 3 years. Especially if you're going to be putting in new landscape beds, or if you've got a lot of perennials or something, I would add the test for organic matter just to see what kind of level you're at. Especially if you've got plants that were doing okay, but they're starting to look a little bit sad, you're not quite sure. Certainly could be that the organic matter is fairly low, and you just need to improve that the microorganisms in your soil. Doing the soil sample, make sure that you're adding fertilizer at the right levels. Those 17 nutrients have relationships with each other, and an excessive amount of phosphorus can actually block the uptake of potassium. So it's really important to get it tested to see because, you know, if you're in the habit of just using 10, 10, 10, and you've used 10, 10, 10 every year, you probably have fairly high phosphorus levels, and you could start to see issues with not only potassium, but you could also have some issues with some micronutrients like iron and zinc. So that soil sample, make sure that you're just not adding just to add stuff. And it's $6, well worth the $6. So when you take your soil sample, you know, there's not much variation within an acre. And really, there's not much variation within 10 acres. So we tell our farmers 1 sample per 10 acres. But I would look at how you've treated the areas. Your vegetable garden, you certainly have amended differently and more often over the years. So I would take your vegetable garden samples separate from the rest of your lawn and landscape. You know, your shrub beds, if you've amended them more, if they've, you know, you've added more compost, you've added more leaf litter, you've put more mulch out, they will have a little bit more organic matter built up in them than maybe your regular landscape where you just have your lawn and your trees. But you wouldn't have to take a bunch. I would just do 1 for the vegetable garden and then 1 for the yard. I've seen where people try to do their front yard, their side yard, their backyard, and there's no call for all of that. Only if you treated areas very differently. You want to go out there and take a bucket and trowel and take multiple samples, mix it all up, and send about 2 cups off to the lab at Clemson. Like I said, $6. The results come back, and this might not be big enough for y'all to see, but it tells you the pH of your soil, and then it tells you the buffer pH. Soil pH is the measure of how acidic or alkaline. Buffer pH is a measure of how many of those hydrogen ions are sitting at those exchange sites. So basically, those 2 numbers together tell us how much lime your soil needs to bring it up to a particular desired pH. So they take the soil pH and the buffer pH, and that's how they calculate that you may need 20 pounds of lime per 100 square feet. And then below that, you have that bar graph for all the nutrients. So you can see what your phosphorus levels are like, your potassium levels are like, your calcium, your magnesium. And from those levels, they'll make recommendations for other fertilizers. So you may see something like needing triple superphosphate, which is a 0.460 because you need more phosphorus in your soil. And then below that bar graph, you see the calculations. Right in there is that cation exchange capacity, and it tells you how fertile your soil is. Sandy soils can be anywhere from 2 to typically 8. In the Midlands, we're lucky to see on average around 8 to 10. I have a 10 for my cation exchange capacity. And like I said, my soil is like beach sand. And so I've been working really hard to get that up to a 10. In comparison, if you were to go out to the Midwest and to where the prairie has been, they have a CEC up in the 90s, close to 100. You can improve your cation exchange capacity. You can improve the fertility by adding organic matter because it just has so much surface area. It helps to hold on to all those nutrients. It has tons of exchange sites. I talked about the kitchen table kind of analogy where like my particle of sand is like my kitchen table where I only have 4 to 6 seats sitting around my kitchen table. And clay particles are kind of like dining room tables where you can fit 12, maybe 14 people around a dining room table. Adding organic matter is like if everybody put their dining room table out in the street back to back, from all around the world, you would have so many seats, so many exchange sites. It's just amazing how much a little bit of organic matter can do to improve your soil. Just because that surface area is exchange holding capacity. And then below that, calculations, you see recommendations, and that's where you get recommendations for your specific crop. So if you're growing roses or vegetables or for your lawn, it'll have the specific recommendations on what fertilizer you should add for those plants to get adequate plant growth. And then that is it. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions.
Mhm.
First off, I'm planning on pulling some azaleas out. We live out in the mountains up near
Mhm.
Table Rock. So where I want to put my kitchen garden is at the top of the hill. My
Mhm.
vegetable garden is at the bottom of the hill. So
Mhm.
based on what you said, I'm thinking that I should get that where I want my kitchen garden tested because it might need more than
Oh
my
yeah.
vegetable garden would need.
Yeah, and actually your
Yeah.
herbs will actually do just fine. They usually don't need, they're not as heavy feeding as your vegetables would be.
Okay.
But yes, I
Okay.
would get that tested
Yeah,
because it
'cause
would be more, it would have had more erosion and more exposure and will
Right.
be less
yeah,
nutrient
'cause-
rich.
yeah, because you had said to just, for 10 acres, which is what we have, you only need a couple of samples, but what I'm using the 10 acres for is very different from one area of it to another.
Right. And since you've amended, then I would definitely take a
Yeah,
couple samples.
I actually haven't amended at all. We have no idea what the previous owner did.
Oh,
and
okay.
we
So this is all brand new.
This is all brand new. We haven't done anything.
Yes, and I would
And-
still, because that vegetable garden, I would assume, and as you dig around and take your samples, so you go out there with a clean bucket and a garden trowel, and
Yeah.
you scoop down, and you want to scoop down about 4 to 6 inches. So come in and just do a scoop. As you do,
Okay,
you'll see the difference in color. You'll see the difference in structure. And when you see something completely different, then you'll know that it's been amended and treated differently. So that
Yeah.
vegetable garden, the soil there will look very different from anywhere else on the property.
okay, thank you.
Especially if they were an active gardener, it would.
Yeah, I have it right now. It's just a field of weeds. So because the previous owner was sick for several years, so
Oh,
who knows
no.
what we're dealing with.
But there's still some residuals, so you'll see some difference in colors.
Yeah, okay. And you were saying something about succulents and I didn't quite catch it because my
So,
headphones went out.
Succulents, they need good drainage. They
Okay.
like water around their roots, but they like it to drain away quickly. So
Gotcha.
they will benefit from a little bit of organic matter, whereas something that's very heavy feeding like my roses and take a lot of water, they like more organic matter. So you can, based on what plants you're trying to grow, you can modulate how much organic matter you add. For example, your kitchen garden, your herbs, especially since you're going to be using this for cooking, you want more essential oils. So you don't want a whole lot of rich growth because you want more of that flavor in the herbs. So you would add less organic matter to your herb garden than you would to
Okay.
a vegetable garden.
Okay, I hadn't thought of that. Thank you.
Yep.
I had a quick question, if you have a
Mhm.
moment. We are building some raised beds for the garden in the hope that our aging backs will have it a little easier. And we are needing to determine what to fill them with. And I didn't know if there was a recipe per se or some resources. Perhaps you have some suggestions. I mean, does one start with just fill dirt and amend it? Do you get the varying different kinds of quote topsoil that you can buy at the landscape yards? We're just not quite certain what the best options might be.
So the problem with fill dirt is that it can be anything. And you really don't want to get into changing textural classes too much. You want to make sure that you come in with something lighter than what you have. Because if you come in with smaller particles, you can definitely cause more issues. It can cause what's called a black layer. So you get kind of this layer of anaerobic conditions where you get more opportunity for diseases and root rots and problems. So the first thing I would start with is going to the bulk places, looking at the filter, but getting a sample first and taking a look at it, because you just want to make sure that you're not getting something that's completely, much heavier. Like if you were to have loamy, you wouldn't want to put just heavy clay down. That would cause problems. Or if you have sand, you wouldn't want to come in with a loam because that would cause issues. I would start with that. I would take a soil sample and see, because you don't want to also have something that's way off base. They do all sorts of stuff to those fill dirts. They usually, what they'll do, unfortunately, they come in, they clear cut the trees for a new neighborhood. They burn the trees, clear cut, remove the topsoil. So you can have stuff that looks really rich and dark, but they've added lime and they've burned trees. So it looks rich and black, but then the pH can be crazy up like an 8. So I would just say, get it sample. And you want something that's kind of close. It can be a little bit higher, but you want something kind of close to what you have. And then organic matter, I would look for any, if they just have the compost itself and just a little bit to help support whatever plant growth, what you want to put there.
We have an area where we've been composting for about 30 years and we sift through it. So basically, if I just found as a base some decent soil, but not particularly the topsoil, because we've seen that where, in fact, we made that mistake in one of the beds, and I think they did have some charcoal and such in it, and the pH came back at the test at 7.8. So that is quite high. So, all right, well, that helps a lot. We'll certainly do that and get a sample and take it from there. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question, Jackie. I don't know for sure if it's perfectly on topic, but it's related to soil. I kind of suspect in my vegetable garden area that we have fusarium wilt. And I don't know, we've tried, last year we tried solarizing, although we may not have managed the solarizing that well. I wondered if you had any advice on just how to deal with that and maybe, and avoid it in the future.
Sure. So what I would do is, the addition of organic matter will help because you're bringing in all kinds of beneficial microorganisms. You can increase the population of beneficial microorganisms over those harmful pathogens. So there is something called cover cropping, and you can do that now. And we have a fact sheet on Clemson's HJIC all about different cover crops. So you can do a fall winter cover crop, and you terminate it right as it goes into bloom, and then you can let that break down in the soil. And that fact sheet goes into details on how to do that. And then there's also an early spring cover crop that you can do. And the addition of more organic matter will help. Plus crop rotation. So going with plants that are going to be resistant to fusarium wilt. So crops that don't have it at all, and then varieties that are resistant to it. And probably it's going to be for a couple of seasons in there. I want to say fusarium wilt might be one of those ones where it can last for 4 years in the soil without, but definitely that's something I would have to look up to say how long it can survive in the soil without a host. But that's one strategy, is cover cropping and then crop rotation. So picking something that does not support fusarium wilt at all. That would be something I don't know off the top of my head. I could research and look it up. So if you send me an email and remind me, I can look into further detail and say, okay, I would plant specifically this there for this amount of time. And then you can come back to your watermelons or your tomatoes or whatever you wanted that was being affected, or your okra that was being affected by the fusarium wilt. And then looking for varieties that are resistant to it. But I would use all of those strategies in conjunction to kind of do it. And I've seen where people have been able to do that. I had Powell Smith was the vegetable specialist, and he was in Lexington County, and he had southern wilt in his vegetable garden, and he wanted to grow heirloom tomatoes, and he never had success because the southern wilt would just get them. He started cover cropping, and he started just with crop rotation, and was able to put so many more beneficial microorganisms in his soil that they outcompeted that southern will. And now he's back to growing heirloom tomatoes, but he just has to manage it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I need some help, please.
Oh dear.
Help. We're new on this property and we're starting off with severely overgrown everything. So we had to chop
Mhm.
down a lot of stuff and kill a few things. And now I'm at a point where it's time to do something with the soil and get new stuff planted. So for instance, they've got an area that is covered in Nandina stumps still and lots of vines and just lots of junk. So I'm
Mhm.
thinking, and hearing you talk, I'm thinking I'm gonna need to get somebody in with the machine. I don't know if it's a tiller or what, to get those stumps and vines out of there. And
Mhm.
then some topsoil and some couple of inches of compost on top of that. And then I'm ready. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and like I said, if anything's bulk, I would just get it tested just to see,
Yeah.
because you want to be careful with one, the pH of whatever you bring in. You just don't want it way high, and the
Yeah.
other is the texture. You don't want to bring in something where the soil particles are finer than what you have, because it can create an artificial layer and create anaerobic conditions. It just leads to problems down the road. But yeah, any kind of topsoil or fill dirt would be fine. Just make sure you look at it first. You just don't want to buy it blindly. You just don't want to go in and say, oh, just bring a bunch to me. And then the compost, no more than 2 inches. Over 2 inches, it's not giving as much of a benefit. You're wasting your money. The benefit doesn't improve over 2 inches. Up to 2 inches, you get a really good benefit from it. And you can some of those what they call end of the year mixes, because sometimes that's like finally rotted shredded pine bark, sand, and usually some compost. That would be fine too, because you probably have clay and that much lighter mix than what you have. So that would be fine too. What they typically call like an end of the year mix, or like Dixie mix in those beds.
Okay. What do you think about using stone for mulch? You see that happening a lot now.
You can. Typically it's okay closer to the home, because it limits the decaying organic matter that would be up against the home. Landscape, I don't like it, because mulch breaks down and helps to add nutrients back into those landscape beds. And so it's a source of nutrient and another way to add organic matter back in. If you're going to do the stone, typically you do landscape fabric, which is not a good thing for plants and trees. So I would say around the home, where you're just going to doing some hardscaping, the stone would be fine. If you really are looking at, lots of trees and shrubs and really lush landscape, then I would just go with an organic mulch, a 3-inch layer, and come in occasionally, pull it back and add a little bit of organic matter.
Underneath. Okay.
And no landscape fabric.
No landscape. Yeah. Everybody's suggesting that.
Nope.
Nope.
Those
None.
holes get clogged, and then you get weeds that grow on top, and it stops movement of that organic matter down to the root system of those trees and shrubs. And so
Wow,
it's not a good thing.
that's news. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was going to do that. Okay, so how do I keep the weeds down then underneath the mulch?
A good 3-inch layer, minimum 3-inch layer of a coarse mulch is the best for limiting weeds.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think we've taken a lot of your time, and I know you're always accessible with questions. So this has been recorded. I'll send it out to everybody. If you have questions, Jackie is usually always copied in on things. And I learned a lot as usual. So thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Oops.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.